So let's talk about Games Workshop's latest Metawatch update and the hints they've been dropping for what they might change in the next balanced data slate. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest competitive 40k update, and they have dropped a few rather tasty hints as to what sort of things they might be updating in the balanced data slate going forward, and rules changes for certain factions. Let's talk through the update, the hints that they've dropped, and a list of 40k faction strength currently, which armies are doing better and worse from their data. First up, I'd say the most interesting things that they've dropped in this update were a few teasers as to what sorts of things they might be doing with the next balanced data slate. Firstly, they have really confirmed the time schedule of this coming out now. In general, they tend to do their data slates quarterly, and we had all the last big changes in early January with Arcs of Omen. It does appear that they're sticking to their time schedule quite tightly for this one. They basically confirmed that it will be after the big Adepticon tournament, sometime in early April around Easter time. Adepticon's going to be in late March, Easter's the 9th of April. I would guess it will probably be sometime a bit before Easter, so I'd guess we have around about a month to wait for that. It does seem like this one could be the very last balance pass of 9th edition Warhammer 40k. 10th edition has been heavily rumoured for summer, so after these rules changes I probably wouldn't expect anything major for 9th edition 40k as we go into a new rule set that's potentially going to be resetting all the codexes to indexes again, if rumours are to be believed. Still though, there'll still be a fair amount of months where people are going to be playing 9th edition after this, so it is kind of exciting to see what sort of things they might be changing. First up, they basically confirmed they would still be looking at the armies that are sticking out of their targeted win percentage a bit. They usually focus on armies that have got a greater than 55% win percentage or less than 45%. By their own metrics at the moment, that would be Dark Angels and Genestealer cults on top, who might be in the line for some nerfs, and Thousand Suns and Deathwatch look like they're the primary focus of their ideas for buffs, though at both ends of the spectrum there are a whole load of armies that are kind of clustered at the lower and higher ends of the meta respectively. It's certainly not impossible that they could see some small tweaks. In their video they did specifically call out that Demons and Custodies might well be getting some small balance updates as well. They're right at the top end of the meta, and if Dark Angels and Genestealer cults get taken down a peg, that would put them as the strongest armies of the game, so again they might get some small balance changes of one sort or another. I'd guess less than the top armies though. As for what we can expect with the balanced data slate changes, these ones are likely to be rules changes rather than points changes. Games Workshop do seem to be in a habit of updating their points when they update their seasons of the game now, and not in between. I'd say that at the moment there probably aren't too many units that are just individual massive problem units all by themselves. I feel like the majority of the changes they're going to make are to army-wide rules and things, or maybe individual rules tweaks to certain datasheets like they did with Flamers. In terms of likely changes that they're going to be making, I feel like they've heavily hinted that one change was going to be happening in the video, specifically by talking about a secondary objective that's relevant to the Dark Angels and the Iron Hands, and I feel like this one probably had crosshairs on it from as soon as they released Arcs of Omen, as it kind of felt like they made a mistake in the first place. In the video they talked about one of the strongest Dark Angel secondaries being Codex Warfare. This is the one for Space Marines where you've just got to try and kill units in your own given doctrine, whether that's tactical with bolter weapons for example, or close combat weapons when you're in the Assault doctrine, but perhaps most notably heavy weapons when you're in the Devastator doctrine. This secondary objective basically abnormally rewards you for killing things in the Devastator doctrine, getting 2 victory points for each unit that you slay, and that was kind of balanced before because you only got the Devastator doctrine for just the one turn. In the first turn of the game, a lot of your opponent's army might be hiding, their casualties are likely to be kind of limited. Now though, with armies like Dark Angels and Iron Hands able to spend the entire game in Devastator doctrine, this one becomes almost auto-include good, provided you've got a whole ton of heavy weapons in your army. If you can kill 6 or 7 units over the course of the game, then you're going to be racking up an enormous victory point score just by doing what you wanted to do anyway. It's really relevant for Dark Angels lists that often wants to just sit in Devastator doctrine to help out their Raven Wing. That also gives them extra speed and the ability to advance while getting their 4+ invul save and still shoot. And of course it's ridiculously relevant to the Iron Hands as well. They didn't mention them in the video, but in terms of win rates they're by far the best Codex Space Marine chapter. They want to sit in Devastator doctrine all game long for their reroll 1s to hit and mobility on their infantry units. If they did change this down to 1 victory point, as I would have guessed it might have been intended, I feel like that could be quite a good targeted nerf to the 2 strongest Space Marine factions that are stomping the meta at the moment. As a side effect, of course, that would nerf Imperial Fist just that little bit more, but at this point Games Workshop seems to have a pretty long history of not really accounting for the lesser played Space Marine chapters that much. Otherwise though, taking a look at their latest win ranking list, they've currently got Dark Angels out on 59% and Genestealer Cult not so far behind on 57%. Not hard to see why Dark Angels have been doing well, with the Raven Wing with their invul saves, all-game fast Devastator Doctrine, and powerful units. They can zoom up the board with ridiculous mobility and damage. And then also the Death Wing with their sheer durability, particularly with Thunderhammer, Storm Shield Terminators, and potentially objectives secured from Rites of War. Will be interesting to see what else they change for these guys. I feel like both the Raven Wing and the Death Wing rules are a bit overblown in their own ways. I wouldn't be surprised if they each got some sort of minor nerf. For Genestealer Cults, and they did say in the video, the win rates perhaps potentially skewed by having a very small amount of quite skilled players that play the faction typically. I feel like they're less of a problem army for 40k at the moment, and if they saw a bit more wide adoption with people who are new to the faction, they probably wouldn't be doing quite so well. Still though, certainly very powerful, lots of bodies for objectives, and a whole load of sneaky tricks to score very high on the secondaries. They do tend to be in control of the game. I feel like if they do maintain this high win percentage, Games Workshop probably will still nerf them in one way or the other. Again, I feel like maybe toning down their faction secondaries might not be the worst idea. I feel like they're probably an army that just succeeds very, very well at playing the mission. Where in terms of raw damage games at the more casual kind of level, I suspect that they're not as big a problem as some of the rest. Otherwise, they did say that Demons and Custodians were kind of waiting in the wings to be top factions if Dark Angels and Genestealer Cults were brought down a peg. Certainly a whole ton of raw power there, and both challenging armies to deal with when played well. And kind of notably absent from this list are the Iron Hands. If they were here, they'd be around about a 56% win rate or so. They've certainly got enough players playing them to be equivalent to one of the major factions, really. I feel like it probably is worth taking them into account. All-game Devastator Doctrine plus their own great Codex support rules mean that they're head and shoulders above most of the rest of the Space Marine chapters. The rules just aren't amazingly balanced now they get all-game Devastator Doctrine. Otherwise, Orcs have been doing pretty well for a while now. Guard have been consistently upper mid-tier. Perhaps the biggest surprise from their numbers are Leagues of Votan, which I feel like they might be just a little bit on the high side here. In general, most other places that keep track of them have generally been seeing them around about 50% or a bit less than that. I don't know if this is just partly Games Workshop's wide-ranging dataset, accounting for a lot more casual games as well, where maybe just the raw damage of them is a bit hard for some people to counter. Otherwise though, looking at the bottom end of Games Workshop's rankings and the armies that they said are most likely to be receiving buffs, here it seems that they're most focusing on the Deathwatch and the Thousand Sons. By their own rankings, the Deathwatch are 39% and the Thousand Sons are 42%, so out of their typical targets for the win rates and things. In the video they mentioned that Deathwatch just don't really have all that many tricks at the moment. I would argue that in their codex they do have a whole bunch of strong rules, things like teleporting Beacon Angelis, a psychic power for a 5+ feel no pain, really quite decent Dreadnought castles as they go. I feel like the options are certainly there. I'd say perhaps their biggest problems are with their core mechanics that are the selling points of playing them in the first place, things like their kill team construction and perhaps their flexible combat doctrines. Both of those could arguably be seen as negatives currently with all the Space Marine updates. Things like Sternguard veterans can arguably be seen as Deathwatch kill teams but better, and those flexible doctrines are kind of actively a negative now that you can sit in Devastator Doctrine all game long. Perhaps the biggest advantage is just getting to Assault Doctrine early, but they aren't a chapter that's got an enormous amount of combat synergies compared with, say, Blood Angels or Space Wolves. At this point, they basically said that they would get some help in the balanced data slates. It'll be interesting to see what sort of form that takes. I feel like messing around with their combat doctrines in some way would be quite a good option. At the moment, that flexible rules that's supposed to be an advantage just seems to be a weakness. Otherwise, for Thousand Sons, in general, they've just had problems since Arcs of Omen. They talked about their secondaries not being too great, so maybe they might get some help out there. They really lost out from the Armour of Contempt change, though. It was quite a big rule for them in combination with All is Dust, and their core units didn't really receive any sort of meaningful points cuts to compensate, unlike certain armies like Space Marines. Otherwise, though, there are a whole ton of armies that are kind of borderline here. There's 5 different ones that they have ranked on 45%, including Tyranids, Blood Angels, Necrons, Admech, and Eldari. I must admit, I do wonder why they're bothering to include Eldari here, as I guess that's mixed Eldar, particularly as they've included Craftworlds as Azayani up on 51%, and for some reason they haven't separated out Inari this time, who I would have been guessing would be scoring pretty highly. That aside though, I feel like a bit of help for some of these wouldn't be too amiss. In particular, in other sources I have seen Admech doing it a little bit worse than this, and worse compared with the rest. I'd be surprised perhaps if they go for too many wide-ranging buffs to all of these though. With their interim datasheets between seasons, they often don't tend to be too wide-reaching in terms of messing things around for every single army in the game. Also, again, I would bear in mind that these don't take any consideration for the more struggling Space Marine chapters at the moment. If you put win rates down here, we'd also be seeing things like Imperial Fists, Raven Guard, Ultramarines and White Scars in this section. Games Workshop balance changes just don't really seem to be massively keen to try and even up the balance between Space Marine chapters all that much. I feel like maybe they just treat them as different sub-factions and aren't really concerned with balancing them in the same way as they're not really that bothered about balancing every single Necron Tomb world, for example. I feel like it would be pretty nice if they threw Imperial Fist or Raven Guard players a bone towards the end of the edition. Those two chapters in particular have just been super underwhelming for basically the entirety of 9th edition Warhammer 40k. Other chapters just basically doing what they do, but better. Imperial Fists don't seem to have deviated from their win rate in the high 20s, though admittedly they'd probably be getting a bit better if people weren't just playing Iron Hands rules, as they're just so much better for a Devastator Doctrine chapter. But still, I really think that they could afford to give them, say, a better doctrine or improve their chapter tactic a bit, maybe just to give them a bit of a lease of life late in the edition. Finally, for their list of armies, we've got a whole bunch of armies in the midfield: Azayani Chaos Knights, Space Wolves Harlequins, Drukhari Grey Knights, Space Marines in general, averaging out the good ones like the Iron Hands and the Salamanders, plus the weaker ones as we just mentioned, and also Imperial Knights as well. In the video they did talk a fair bit about them being kind of pleased with their balance at the moment in Arcs of Omen. I must admit, at least by the numbers, they do seem to have done impressively well with it. It kind of turns most of 40k on its head with things like a new force organisation chart, a few big changes to core rules in the game, and some pretty sweeping changes, positive and negative, to a bunch of different armies. I was wondering if we might see at least a couple more factions just sticking out massively powerfully at the top or massively weak at the bottom, but it seems that that's really not been the case for the most part. In terms of game balance for 40k as the whole, it does seem to be kind of similar to Nephilim, which I think is pretty impressive given the big changes, seeing as Nephilim balance was about as good as 40k got for a very, very long time, and certainly better than most of the train wreck that 9th edition was before that. It's been nice to get away from the era of the latest codex just being flat better than everything else, and having big tournaments won by a massive variety of armies, perhaps more than we've seen in 40k's past in a very long time. Obviously, game balance is certainly not perfect, and it probably never will be, but I feel like it is worth mentioning it when Games Workshop do manage to improve things compared with previously. Otherwise they just don't really have much incentive to improve if everyone's just angry at them regardless of what they do. In terms of balance changes for the midfield, I'd guess that anything around this sort of area is probably not going to receive any sort of update as per the balanced data slate. It seems that these interim rules change ones typically tend to focus on the top and the bottom end of the meta, and then maybe just a few bug fixes at best for anything in the midfield, which they'll be kind of happy with. Obviously, a bunch of these armies are far from perfect in terms of internal codex balance. Some units are a lot better than others, and some units are spending a lot of time on the shelf, but I'd argue that's probably quite hard to fix at the moment in terms of pure rules and things, unless they were going to be fiddling with the factions' points, which, as I mentioned, I suspect that they probably won't do, at least by their past precedent. They usually seem to keep the interim balance changes for rules, and the ones that go along with their season changes for points. In any case, though, seems like an interesting teaser of the future. Overall, it looks like we've got a balanced data slate coming out in early April. At the moment, the crosshairs of the balance changes are focused on the Dark Angels and Genestealer cult, plus maybe Demons and Custodes. I suspect that we'll get a change to Codex Warfare, and probably a few other bits and bobs besides. It looks like Thousand Suns and Deathwatch will be receiving some sort of a buff in this one, and they did say that they'd be monitoring things up to the time with more data. If any armies start to do it even better or even worse, then they might attract more attention than this. Let me know your thoughts on the update though. Do you think that the right armies are attracting attention? And what would you most like them to do with these rule changes for the balanced data slate, potentially the last balance patch of 9th edition, before we get basically a whole new game? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and rules updates, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll absolutely be covering the balanced data slate changes when they come out. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the video, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.